For anyone who doesn't know, this is Eric Weiss, orange-pilled Michael Saylor.
When Michael's interested in something, you realize how quickly that you don't know that much about it. It's hard to hodl through, I think it's harder to hodl through the good times than it is the bad ones, because nobody wants to sell at the bottom, but it's hard not to sell at the top. It's hard not to sell when you could sell and do things in fiat that are important to you.
He ended up selling like 10,000 Bitcoin to buy a one-bedroom apartment.
Yeah.
I feel like everyone has that story, you know?
It's an expensive apartment. I would love to buy a new home right now, but I can't, because I know that if I wait a year or two, that home is going to be free.
What would you say to someone that they see Bitcoin at 100K and they're like, you know what, I've missed the boat?
Yeah.
Are they late? What's up, man?
How you doing?
First in-person interview, honor to have you. For anyone who doesn't know, this is Eric Weiss, orange-pilled Michael Saylor. So how was that like, man? Like, we've come such a long way. I think that was like 2020 or 2021.
That was 2020, yeah.
So how were the early days? How did you receive it? I'm sure it took a while.
It did. Thanks for having me. Honored to be your first in-person interview. We've been friends for a very long time. And I got into this space before Michael did. I discovered Bitcoin and bought my first Bitcoin in 2013. And I'd been mentioning it occasionally, and he was not interested in hearing about it at all. It was varying degrees of dismissing the conversation. But you know, Michael was running a company with a couple thousand employees and competing with the likes of Microsoft and Salesforce, which is like brutally impossible. I mean, you know, he's competing against companies that are giving away the product that he's offering essentially for free. So it's just a really tough business. And he was out there, you know, he's running the gauntlet every day and wasn't really interested in this internet money thing that I was raving about. And so he was like, no interest, very dismissive for a long time. And then it was during the pandemic. We were hanging out at his house during the days here in Miami, just because the surroundings there are quite comfortable, as you know, relative to my apartment, and trying to make sense of what was going on in the world. Everything is closed, all businesses are closed, and yet the stock market's going up, and you know, things just weren't making sense. And I said, anytime there's big change like this, there's opportunity. We just have to find it. And then I started talking about Bitcoin again, and instead of dismissing the topic, you know, he said, okay, tell me more about that. And I was like, okay, you know, here we go. And we spoke about Bitcoin for days and days, maybe weeks. When Michael's interested in something, you realize how quickly that you don't know that much about it. It was like probably the second day that we were talking about it, you know, he's asking me about hashing and stuff, and I'm like, I don't know, dude. So yeah, we went pretty deep, and then after a while, he said, well, if I wanted to buy some of this stuff, how would I go about doing that? And so I got him set up to buy it, and that took, at the time, a couple months. And then one day I was pulling into a restaurant down here, Smith & Wolenski's, and the phone rings. Normally he'll text, you know, but phone rings, I'm like, oh no, something might have happened. So I'm like, what's up? And he's like, well, I bought Bitcoin. And I'm like, great. And at the time, Bitcoin was exactly $10,000, you know, per BTC. And he goes, yeah, 10,000. And I go, you bought one Bitcoin? It's like, no, Eric, I bought 10,000 Bitcoin. And I went from being very excited that I, you know, had gotten my buddy into Bitcoin to being like, oh shit. Because, you know, if you've been in for a while, you know nobody gets like a clear path up and to the right, that there's volatility, and $100 million commitment is an extraordinary thing. And as we sit here today, you know, that was a $1 billion trade.
Yeah.
So
10x.
10x.
And it's just getting started, in my opinion, as well.
We agree on that one. We agree on that one.
So Eric, let me ask you something. So incredible story, by the way. And I mean, like, you technically could take credit. Technically, of course. Like,
technically.
You facilitated.
I don't know what good it would do me, but yeah.
Did you ever imagined, like, at that time, did you ever imagine MicroStrategy's performance this year? Because like,
No.
in the beginning of the year, like, I'll be honest with you, I'm like, why didn't I just buy MicroStrategy instead of Bitcoin? Which is like such a non-Bitcoin thing to say, but it's performed extremely well. It put pressure on Microsoft, put pressure on Amazon. There was news the other day that Meta was like, shareholders were like putting pressure. It doesn't mean they're going to do it, but it's a step in the right
part
direction.
Of the discussion,
And I think it's an inevitability that they're just going to buy at a higher price. But did you ever imagine that MicroStrategy was going to do what it did this year?
When we were having those discussions, the conversation wasn't about MicroStrategy. I didn't know, he didn't share with me, that he was wrestling with, finding a store of value for MicroStrategy's cash position. And he felt like, they were sitting on $500 million in cash. He, deemed inflation to be about 10%. They're losing about $50 million a year in purchasing power. And he's got 2,000 people working their ass off to try to make $50 million a year. So he felt like he was on a treadmill. That was a big part of his motivation and why he was receptive to hearing about it at that time. But this was all kind of unbeknown to me. And I guess now we know that he couldn't get the company quite to act so quickly. So that first purchase, the 10,000 Bitcoin, that was personal. That's not MicroStrategy purchase. So as far as MicroStrategy's performance, no, I didn't really have any idea. And I'm not sure that anyone did. It required a lot of execution on Michael and MicroStrategy's part to deliver that. And, I think people are getting a lot of insight into Michael's personality through the podcast and through his actions in Bitcoin. And, it's very kind of Michael Jordan-esque. If you ever read the book Relentless, you get real insight into Michael Jordan's personality and how competitive he was and, how important winning was to him. And you see a lot of that in Michael. So when you apply that to MicroStrategy, it wasn't enough to get MicroStrategy out of this struggling company range into, a higher performer. Like his goals for MicroStrategy are very high.
Yeah.
And he's very resourceful and very determined. So he keeps, he's become an expert on economics. He's become an expert on Bitcoin, obviously. He's become an expert on balance sheet optimization for a public company and issuing securities in a creative way from a Bitcoin point of view. And I think he's going to continue to do great things.
Absolutely. I mean, that redemption arc was insane. Right. So like in the 90s, the dot-com bubble, and then essentially the stock went somewhat sideways for, 10, 15, 20 years. And then all of a sudden, redemption, the vindication, which I think a lot of us Bitcoiners feel, right? Initially you get in, you kind of feel stupid. Most people get in the bull market, the first cycle. And then after the second or the third cycle, you're like, I'm vindicated. But of course, Michael Saylor or nation states, it's on a different level. Much more capital involved. But I still see it as the redemption arc, the vindication that a lot of us Bitcoiners go through.
Without a doubt. I think that, one of the interesting things about Bitcoin is people find it kind of when they have a need to find it. And generally when you need to find it, there's some form of desperation in your world, right? You either have a zombie company that's struggling, that's fallen out of favor. MicroStrategy arguably fell into that category, back in 2000, Semler Scientific, some of these others, right? These are not so much MicroStrategy, but they're zombie-ish companies, right? That are having trouble competing or winning in their area. And this is a solution. Same thing for individuals, right? It's like you're getting crushed by inflation, you're having trouble winning and getting ahead. It's very hard to get ahead from the pack, especially if you follow traditional financial investment advice. And so people find Bitcoin when they need it. And when you don't need it, in those early years that we talked about with Michael, right? Where he's like crushing it in business. He has won at life, right? Starting from nothing to become a billionaire and, entrepreneur, public company, et cetera. So it's like, you don't need that, right? You're running your own successful business. You got all these employees. You're a master of the universe. You don't need this. And it's only when there's an opportunity to need something in your life that you kind of discover Bitcoin and your mind is open to it. And so it's kind of an advantage for those of us who got in earlier that we were, looking for something in some way earlier. And so those people, when I tell people when they're trying to orange pill friends or something who aren't getting it or family, just be patient, just wait. People will, in Bitcoin parlance, obviously, we say, people get Bitcoin at the price they deserve. But the truth is people get Bitcoin when they're ready to get Bitcoin.
Absolutely. You plant the seed.
Yeah.
And then what ends up happening is a cycle goes by. They didn't listen to you, but they sure do remember.
Yeah, they watch.
When you told them and when the price was.
Yeah.
And eventually there's this inevitable capitulation. That's been my experience. I'm 9 years in the industry, a little bit shorter than you.
Yeah.
But again, I've seen this happen over and over again. Now
you earn your stripes though, like you said, right?
Yes.
Like
2 cycles.
Nobody gets straight up. So that first cycle, all the Bitcoiners are like, yeah, you're going to rug us. You're not here for the long haul. You're just coming to make a quick buck. And then you live through your first cycle, and then they see, did this person hodl? Are they sticking around? Are they still buying? Did they buy through the dips? Are they buying at the highs? You got to earn, it's like, verify, don't trust in Bitcoin land, right? So, and then you do get that redemption, and, you do get that validation, and it feels good. And then you also get an appreciation for, it's not, people will say you got lucky kind of narrative, right? It's very hard to hodl. It's hard to hodl through, I think it's harder to hodl through the good times than it is the bad ones, because nobody wants to sell at the bottom. But it's hard not to sell at the top. It's hard not to sell when you could sell and do things in fiat that are important to you. Yeah. So, the people who have hodled for all these years, I'm happy for them. They deserve the rewards that are coming their way.
Yeah, you change. There's a cost to it. Like hodling, if you describe it, it seems easy.
It's so hard.
But you change. You change as a person.
Yeah.
The years that goes by. It's an emotional journey.
It is.
And the more of your net worth is in Bitcoin, the more questions you start asking about money, the more questions you start asking about the system. Initially, it's like, oh, I want to get rich. But then, you come for the money, stay for the revolution. Very interesting phenomenon. Now, I want to talk about the incoming administration.
Okay.
Right? So we're 5 days from Inauguration Day at the time of recording. I think what happened last year with Operation Choke Point 2.0, and then that creating an opportunity for the opposing political party to capitalize on it and say, hey, look, these are voters, let's do it. And it happened a lot sooner than anticipated. I thought that Bitcoin was going to enter into the political discussion by 2028. It was going to happen. Yep. It was inevitability. It happened a lot sooner. And of course, Trump won the election. We know he's pro-Bitcoin. David Bailey, there was a clip of him going viral at the 100K party at Michael Saylor's, where he's saying that Trump owns a lot of Bitcoin. How do you feel about the incoming administration and the regulatory environment in 2025?
Yeah, I think you have to give Donald Trump a lot of credit here. Just for a little history lesson for those that don't know, what really happened was, it kind of goes back to SAB 121, which is this recommendation from the SEC and Gary Gensler that banks can't custody Bitcoin or digital assets without holding one-to-one dollar reserves. And banks just don't do that. That's not the banking model. They don't want to hold one-for-one reserves. It defeats the purpose. They can't lend the money out and earn money on it, right? So it's essentially a death blow for banks custodying crypto. And so what happened was, this was taken up by Congress. It was pretty, certain that the Republicans were going to vote to repeal this, that banks should be able to custody crypto. The Democrats were going to kind of keep the party line and vote against it, and it probably wouldn't pass, and it would be a non-issue. But what happened was, the Democrats also agreed that banks should be able to custody crypto, like mainstream Democrats, the Nancy Pelosi's and Chuck Schumer's of the world, right? And what happened was, the Biden administration was forced to veto this, right? And that was a big deal, because the entire crypto world freaked out, and people got a glimpse of just how many pro-crypto people there were. And Trump, so I give him credit, he recognized this and he said, wait a minute, there's like 30 million crypto voters out there who are single issue voters for the most part. There's a lot of votes to be had for being pro-crypto. There are no votes to be had for being anti-crypto. And so it was at that point that he came out really strong vocally, in our favor. The Biden administration freaked out. I think someone in the administration reached out to Gensler and said, hey, you just cost us this election, and you need to get us our crypto voters back. And then the Ethereum ETFs were clearly getting rejected at the time. And I think that's the only card they had to play. So those Ethereum ETFs got approved overnight. as a way to show that the administration was pro crypto to try to get some of those votes back. But Trump, to his credit, he went up the learning curve, leaned into it. And I think he really is on our side. It's not just Trump, right? It's his entire administration, assuming everybody who's nominated gets confirmed. But you've got a Secretary of Treasury that's very pro Bitcoin and crypto. You've got RFK, who's obviously on our side. You've got Howard Lutnick, Secretary of Commerce, who super pro Bitcoin and crypto. You've got Paul Atkins coming in as chair of the SEC, who's very much on our side. And now we're hearing, which I've heard a couple times now in backroom conversations, that day one SAB 121 is going away. And that is a major catalyst for Bitcoin. I think that Bitcoin can probably get to 500,000 on its own without SAB 121 going away, but it's SAB 121 going away that really makes the upside unlimited, because you really do need to be able to borrow against your Bitcoin and not have to sell it to do the things you want to do in life in order for this asset to really explode. If perfect analogy would be homes, right? Like, what would home prices be if you couldn't get a mortgage against them?
Yeah, and I want to talk about and appreciate that insight. I didn't know that backstory, which is quite interesting. And you said that the repealing of the SAB 121 is one of the catalysts, and it kind of reminds me of the spaces that Saylor joined. He said 3 things need to happen in order for Bitcoin to hit $5 million.
Okay.
The ETF, the FASB accounting rules,
yep,
and the ability for banks to custody Bitcoin, which is what you just
there
talked
you go.
about.
Third leg of the stool.
That's going into play in January, you anticipate?
I think I'd be surprised if it's not into play within a week after Trump being inaugurated. Mm-hmm. I've been hearing for a while that it's a day one thing, so that will be interesting. And then it's not like that's going to be repealed and then banks are going to start. JP Morgan's not going to custody your Bitcoin tomorrow. They've got to go up the curve in developing custody solutions, technological solutions for this. So I do think it'll be a massive catalyst, probably be 12 to 24 months before it's really in full effect, but that's a really, really big deal. I don't think it could be overstated how big that is.
I realized that, but I didn't know the details, and I appreciate you explaining that to me. Now, there is something that you said earlier, which I want to touch on, because I've heard you say this on other podcasts, which is the idea of don't sell your Bitcoin. Don't use your Bitcoin to buy goods and services. And this idea of, and I've heard Saylor say this as well, I'm just connecting the dots, this idea that Bitcoin is pristine collateral, right? You're going to be able to borrow against that. So could you elaborate a little bit on that? Because Bitcoiners like myself, we've just been here a while, we're stacking, we don't want to sell our stack. And you're like, Nico, you shouldn't have to do that. It's the best collateral the world has ever seen. So are we going to see more services? Are banks supposed to be offering this?
We're not there yet. Okay. So it's really hard now. We're all in that situation. All of us that have been stacking for a long time. I'm personally in that situation, right? Like I would love to buy a new home right now, but I can't, because I know that if I wait a year or two, that home is going to be free. Mm-hmm. Right. So and there's no way to borrow against it right now, kind of thing. So when I said don't sell your Bitcoin, it's going to be very tough to get back on that podcast, which went more viral than I had anticipated. It was really, that stemmed from, I had a lot's a relative thing, but for me, I had a lot of Bitcoin in 2013 that I bought at roughly $600 per Bitcoin, and then in 2014. I sold that Bitcoin, and it took, how many was that, 2016 till now. So it took about 8 or 9 years for me to get back to where I was. So it's once you sell your Bitcoin, it's very hard to get it back.
Yeah, and
very hard.
It's interesting that you tell me this, because I was with, oh my God, I can't pronounce his name. I'm going to butcher it, but I was with, one Bitcoin OG. He was like the first programmer that Satoshi ever spoke to. Okay. And he did a presentation in Lugano in Switzerland called My Peak Success Story. And essentially, the long story short, he ended up selling like 10,000 Bitcoin to buy a 1-bedroom apartment.
Yeah.
I feel like everyone has that story, you know?
It's an expensive apartment.
And then you burn your finger and you're like, okay, this is probably not a good idea. So Eric, another thing
it's $1 billion apartment.
Right? So one of the things that happened in 2024 that was also pretty exciting was the introduction of the ETFs, right? Yep. And then not only the introduction, with the SEC dragging their feet, and the launch was pretty butchered, like someone hacked the account or something like that.
The SEC's Twitter account was hacked, and there was a false announcement of approval.
And the volatility swung 10%.
And yet it was still the most successful ETF launch in history.
That's what I want to talk about, right? The idea that the Bitcoin ETFs was the most successful ETFs in history. Larry Fink, right? Very influential, powerful person. He's essentially saying Satoshi's gospel on CNBC. I would have never have imagined that, 5 years ago. I think his quote from 2017, 2018 was, Bitcoin is an index of money laundering. And of course, number go up technology does what number go up technology does.
Right.
And he changed his mind. And now we have BlackRock in the game.
Yeah.
Right? So is that just going to continue to accelerate? Do you see the ETFs?
I think the big thing about the ETF approval, in my opinion, was not just that we had a domesticated form of Bitcoin that nation states don't have to be afraid. People are going to, they don't have to be concerned about capital controls. It's an exchange traded item, right? So you don't have to worry about people, like Bitcoin, moving it around. It's more that we cross this regulatory chasm into legitimacy. So there was a lot of discussion, which, people who are, newer to Bitcoin, going forward in the next handful of years won't ever know. There was discussion as to whether or not this was going to get outlawed or be legal or not. And we crossed that chasm with the ETF. And we crossed it in a way that we're never going back, because it's now in the hands of retirement funds, pension funds, endowment funds, municipalities. It's there. It's never going to be outlawed, right? And that, to me, was the big significance of the ETF approval. So that's a big deal. Yes, it was great for capital inflows, and that's why they're the most successful ETFs. I think that 90% of the people, companies, countries that are going to buy Bitcoin haven't bought their first sat yet. So I think there's plenty more adoption to come.
Yo, I want to tell you about the best place to build your automatic self-custody Bitcoin stack. I'm talking about bitcoinwell.com. What makes bitcoinwell.com different is that it's a completely non-custodial platform, meaning as soon as you buy Bitcoin and the funds clear, it goes straight to your self-custody Bitcoin wallet address. And that perfectly aligns with the Simply Bitcoin ethos of the separation of money and state. Support Bitcoin on-ramps that are self-custody by default. To get started, go to bitcoinwell.com today. It takes 2 to 5 minutes to sign up, and bada bing, bada boom, you're ready to buy Bitcoin.
So we just continue to see all this good news, right? Like I have to make YouTube videos every single day, and initially when you talk about Bitcoin strategic reserve, it would get a ton of views.
Yeah.
Now that has been normalized, right? Which we would have never have imagined this 4 or 5 years ago. So my question to you is, why are we still at 100K? Like, what's going on? This is boring. We're like poking. I don't know if you've seen the meme.
Yeah.
The guy poking Bitcoin with a stick.
Things take longer than people think. Investor behavior is slow to change. It's really, most people who have investable capital, their primary job is not investing that capital. They have a profession of some kind. They're a doctor, they're a lawyer, they're an entrepreneur, and they give their capital to a trusted third party who specializes that, and they say, whatever you think. And they've had this playbook for decades of this diversified portfolio and certain amount of bonds, certain amount of equities, and there's no place for Bitcoin in that portfolio, right? In this mentality. So the first place that people start to think about maybe Bitcoin, there's a place for this, is, well, okay, it's a digital gold, right? And maybe we can put some in, take X% of my gold allocation and let's put some Bitcoin in there. But the challenge with that is most people don't want to own gold, right? They're like, yeah, I don't need that little store of value thing. That's not appealing to me. So the market that we're talking to there from the investor world is relatively small. And as people start to realize a couple things, number one, the biggest problem the entire world has is a store of value. Inflation rates are not what your government is telling you. And I feel like this narrative is growing and people are starting to understand this more, that the real inflation rate is different than what you're being told. And once people understand that, and once people understand that your S&P 500 thing that's delivering you 10%, you're on a treadmill. You're not getting wealthier. You're not making any progress. And they start looking for ways to actually store their, value outside of this fiat system. I think we'll see a lot of traction from a variety of, places. In particular, I think nation states with fiat currency are going to be huge adopters. There's more than 160 fiat currencies that still exist. 50 years from now, I'd be very surprised if we have more than 20. So what's going to happen to 100 plus fiat currencies that are going away? I mean, all 100 of those countries could print their own crappy currency, which is dying right now, and buy Bitcoin with it, or they could buy Bitcoin and back their currency with it, or switch to Bitcoin. There's a number of things they could do. But the bottom line is there are a lot of people in those countries and the countries themselves that are dying, right? They're experiencing financial death. So there's a lot of demand.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and one of the things also, Eric, which is the idea of inflation, right? I think most of society has been sold on this idea that money needs to lose purchasing power in order to function.
Yeah.
I personally, that to me is the most perplexing thing, right?
Total BS.
And, there's never been a money that has existed like Bitcoin, where every single day that Bitcoin continues to exist, it proves that not only can money exist without inflation,
sure.
I know it's not deflationary, but I'm going to use the term anyways. Money can exist that is deflationary. I'm just using it for the sake of this conversation. So what's your take on that? Do you think this is of course, there's institutional adoption, there's potentially nation state adoption, talk about the strategic Bitcoin reserve on the federal level, on the state level. What about individuals? Do you see this becoming individuals all over the world adopting Bitcoin as they realize that it's just better money?
I mean, it's the most egalitarian thing on the planet, right? The truth is, and I was always perplexed by the fact that there wasn't more support for Bitcoin on the Democrat side of politics, because the constituency that they claim to represent, your paycheck to paycheck worker who does have a little bit of savings, whether it's $20 a month, $100 a month, $1,000 a month, whatever it is, they're saving in a fiat currency that is getting killed, and they're the ones suffering the most. Whereas if they were saving in something that was actually appreciating on a relative basis to fiat currency, they might actually get ahead. And then you talk about how there's so many people on the planet that are unbanked, who can't get banked, and that's why they can't save. But they all have a smartphone, an Android phone of some kind. As long as you can have an Android phone, you can bank yourself in Bitcoin in something that is going to appreciate in value, not depreciate. So I do think that individuals are going to be the biggest beneficiary of Bitcoin's benefits. Nation states, companies obviously will participate, and they'll do it on a larger scale. But it's most important for the individual, in my opinion. Yeah, inflation is just like this pernicious tax on people. And if you're really cynical, you could take a view that this is government's way of suppressing the masses and keeping people down. I don't think you need to be that cynical. Like you said, we just didn't have money this perfect before, and now we do. And it just takes, this is some pretty high level education and thought stuff for the average person to grasp. Most people don't start questioning, is the inflation rate that I'm being told real? What is inflation? What does it mean? How does it even affect my life? Most people think, it doesn't matter to me, man. I don't care. I don't have any stocks. It doesn't, So most people just don't get it. So there's a lot of education that needs to take place.
What do you think is going to happen to governments, right? So one of the, and a lot, again, this is like you said, this is deep down the rabbit hole, but one of the primary funding mechanisms for governments that have popular fiat currencies, I'll put it like that, is printing money. You can make a solid argument that with the adoption of Bitcoin, all of a sudden that revenue stream starts to go away. And no?
I mean, it could. I think that's too cynical.
Okay. And how so?
Well, governments can embrace Bitcoin. So, like, I designed these U.S. Treasury bonds for Bitcoin that hopefully are getting presented to the future Secretary of the Treasury.
That's fascinating.
Where the government could issue these zero coupon bonds. So zero coupon bond doesn't have a coupon that pays an interest rate. You buy it at an original issue discount and it accretes to the face value at maturity, and then you get paid. So say a 10-year zero coupon treasury bond now you might buy for, it's got a par value of $1,000. You may pay $650 today, and in 10 years you get $1,000. And I don't know, that probably equates to something like a 6 or 7% yield. But the government could issue those bonds and say, we're going to use the proceeds to buy Bitcoin. And then that bond could be callable every year at par, right? So if you paid $650 for it today and it gets called in the end of 1 year, you're going to get a much higher return. Like you'll get a 35% return if you paid $650, right? Because you're getting $1,000 after 1 year. And the government could tie that to the performance of Bitcoin. So if Bitcoin is up 100% at the end of year one, we pay off the bond and you make 35%. The government's thrilled. They issued $1 billion of this 10-year note, and they took the $1 billion, they bought $1 billion of Bitcoin. The Bitcoin's now worth $2 billion, and they share some of it with the investor. So, and you could have that callable every year up until maturity. So in the worst case scenario, the investor is getting whatever the normal yield for a 10-year zero coupon treasury bond would be. And if Bitcoin performs really well in the interim, they're going to get a better return than they normally would. So it's kind of a win-win. The government gets to raise money to buy Bitcoin and gets to share some of the, profit with the investor.
That's fascinating. And do you think so? And you said that there's interest in the current administration to do this. Eric,
I don't know. I don't know that there's interest. I have a friend and a business partner who is friendly with some folks in the administration who is going to share this idea with them. So we'll see. Hopefully they have an interest.
I mean, one of the things I never forget that Saylor said was the first country that uses their money printer to buy Bitcoin is going to win.
Yeah. I think a lot of people are going to win. But yes, there's certainly advantages to being first, just like we have a little bit of an advantage to the 90% of the population that hasn't bought Bitcoin yet. That's probably going to pay a slightly higher price than we did.
So one of the things also that you said, and I think we were talking about it earlier in the conversation, but I just want to explain to everyone who's watching, the audience, the potential here, right? So I'm sure that you felt this in 2013. I definitely felt this in 2016.
Yep.
Like, I'm late.
Yeah.
$700, $800 Bitcoin. Like, I knew people that bought it at $10,
Right.
$100. Like, this is over. I've lost. The ship has sailed. What would you say to someone that they see Bitcoin at 100K and they're like, you know what, I've missed the boat?
Yeah.
Are they late?
Not even a little bit. Everything in investing has to be viewed on a risk-adjusted basis. What's the risk you're taking for the return that you expect to get or hope to get? And I think it's very, very clear that Bitcoin today at roughly $100,000 per Bitcoin on a risk-adjusted basis is a much better investment than it was at $5, $500, $5,000 per Bitcoin, right? Because at that point, it was essentially venture capital. There's a 1 in 100 shot that this is going to work out and fulfill the expectations that even the biggest believers had, right? And this is evidenced by people like Adam Back, right? Who played an integral role in the technology proof of work that's behind Bitcoin. And he has said, it was kind of cool, but he didn't think it was going to turn into what it turned into. And he didn't start getting involved until much later in buying Bitcoin himself. So it was just a very high risk thing with no certainty that it was going to achieve any of its objectives. And now where we sit, it seems highly likely that it's going to achieve these objectives. And from where we are now at roughly a tenth of the valuation of gold, right? We have 9x from here to get to gold roughly. So, I think, all you really have to do is have the reasonable opinion that maybe Bitcoin's going to flip gold, that this digital gold is going to exceed analog gold. And there's plenty of precedent for that. Pretty much every digital successor of an analog predecessor doesn't just equal it, it goes way past. Whether you think of rotary phones and mobile phones is like a great example, right? And so it's likely that Bitcoin will materially surpass gold. And that seems probable at this point. It's not venture capital type 1 in 100 kind of stuff. So on a risk adjusted basis, I think, looking for a 9x return here is like a very reasonable outcome.
And 9x is solid. What is that? What's the timeline? I know we're heading into speculation territory.
That's above my pay grade. I don't know. It depends on so many things that are outside our control. You mentioned a strategic Bitcoin reserve a couple times. I have no expectation that happens. If it does, great. That would accelerate things dramatically. I think it makes great sense for it to happen. Whether or not we get there, I don't think is really material to Bitcoin. There are nation states around the world that will absolutely do that out of necessity. US, one could debate the degree of necessity. It would be great. It would be smart. Trump has kind of expressed that he wants to be a leader in that. And if he did, it would be a genius move on his part, and it would could really help the United States from a solvency point of view. So I hope we get there. But it's going to get adopted, and there's so little of this stuff out there. I mean, there's 63, 65 million millionaires in the world. Mm-hmm. There's not even enough Bitcoin for every millionaire in the world to own like a third of a Bitcoin.
Yeah, it's easy.
We're talking about something really scarce.
Yeah,
and it doesn't take too many individuals, companies, nation states, municipalities to adopt it for all of a sudden they're just feel like there's not a lot to go around.
Yeah, and then out of those 21 million, like 4 million are
lost forever.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it's like 17 million.
Another couple million hasn't come out yet. Be waiting around to the year 2140. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's pretty scarce.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely scarce.
Absolutely.
I don't think anything else you could say that about.
No, it's not just the scarcity is key, but also the bear aspect of it is as well.
Okay.
You really need to be able to take possession of it for it to have value and for it to be something that no one and nothing can seize from you.
So in Nashville, Michael Saylor had a presentation. So his base case by 2040, right, was
2040?
2045. So it's 21 years.
21 years.
21 years. Yeah. So 20 years from 2045.
Okay.
His bear case was $3 million per coin.
Yep.
His base case was $13 million per coin.
Yeah.
And his bull case was $49 million per coin. So
I remember those numbers.
What do you think about that?
I mean, Michael's an intelligent guy. He put some work into the model. I think he's looking at like a 29% CAGR in his base case or something.
That's bearish, isn't it?
I don't find it constructive to get into that. I just look at it from a more simplistic macro point of view. Gotcha. Right? It's like, it's very scarce. There's a fixed amount. Everybody in the world is starting to want this stuff. We went from being persona non grata by the administration to in control. Not just liked, but in control. And that's powerful. And when the world sees that the US is embracing this, then you get a lot of that game theory, and you'll see other nation states and country, and companies and municipalities clamor to get this. And it kind of starts a little bit of an arms race of, folks around the world trying to accumulate Bitcoin. So where the price goes, I don't know. I do know that relative to other investments, there's no execution risk like there is with a company where management could screw you, miss a quarter, do something unsavory. There's no nation state risk. There's none of these massive risks that face every other type of investment, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it reminds me when you were saying this of something that we were talking about earlier, right? And that was very interesting, right? Which is the idea that the official inflation rate is 3%.
Yeah.
But you say it was 10%. That's like what people are hoping they get on a yearly basis. And if you're saying that the anticipated, you're not saying this, but in Michael Saylor's presentation, he's expecting 29% for the next 20 or so years. Yeah. It seems like Bitcoin is the only option when you look at it that way. And I think he actually made that case in Nashville.
There will be assets that outperform 29% in any given year for sure, right? There'll be plenty of them. The challenge is, can you do it year after year? And what happens the year after you outperform? Do you outperform for 2 years in a row? Do you outperform for 3 years in a row? What happens in the year that you don't outperform? Do you go bust? And one thing that is proven that investors can't really do is you can't make those predictions. You can't. If it was so easy to pick the top, investors would do that. Mm-hmm. You can't pick a top so easily. So Bitcoin really eliminates a lot of that execution risk, which is part of what makes it unattractive to people on Wall Street, right? It's like Wall Street is based on charging people money for your investment advice, your continued investment advice. If your investment advice is buy Bitcoin, how are you going to make money on that as Wall Street, right? Like, what are you going to tell them next week or next year? Buy more Bitcoin? So, it goes in the face of a lot of what's ingrained in our society. And so I think it's great that there are enough naysayers still. That's why the price is what it is, and it's not 10 million a coin right now. And if one believes that this is going the direction it's going, then this is a gift to you that there are as many skeptics as there are, because that skepticism and those people shorting it, that's what keeps the price down and makes it so that you get to buy more sats for less.
So one of the things that you talked about was just Wall Street. Like, how are they going to make money? Yeah. Some people, I'm not saying this, but I've heard other people say it, they call it rent seek, right? Yeah. What happens to Wall Street? Because there's a whole industry built on getting you a yearly return. Right?
Don't underestimate Wall Street. Wall Street
There we go. Okay.
Yeah, Wall Street is very savvy. I mean, they will productize Bitcoin in a way that is very lucrative for them. MicroStrategy is a great example of it, right? I mean, look what MicroStrategy is doing. They're issuing bonds. They're talking about doing preferred stock. They're issuing equity. They're doing they're securitizing Bitcoin in a number of different ways. There'll be Bitcoin-backed mortgages, bonds. Wall Street is extraordinarily innovative. The good news is when they become innovative like this, it's good for the underlying asset, so it's good for Bitcoin. But they will have a seat at the table. They absolutely will. The counterculture Bitcoin anarchist view, yes, those people will have to unfortunately get wealthy at the hands of groups that they may find distasteful, but they're welcome to go find other, anarchist kind of endeavors if it no longer suits their need. But the truth is, if you want to win a war of money, it's won with money. And Wall Street has the money.
I love that. And it reminds me of a quote that I heard. I forget who said this, but one of the things about Bitcoin is you have to be okay with even your worst enemy using it, and you just have to be okay with it, right? So I think Bitcoin in its early history, it kind of lived in the shadows for a little bit. Yeah. And I think since the approval of the ETF, it essentially became legitimized in the eyes of traditional finance. Sure. And now with the Trump administration going in, no one knows, but there's a non-zero chance that it could be legitimized in the eyes of the US government in 2025.
I think it's been legitimized in the eyes of the US government, but I agree with your point. I think people are just going to have to get comfortable with the fact that Bitcoin is about freedom. And you could say exactly what you said about freedom, right? Whether it's freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is, tolerating, someone saying exactly what you don't want to hear them say. That's freedom of speech. Bitcoin is about freedom and sovereignty. And part of that is people Bitcoining in a way that you don't approve of. And that's what's beautiful about it. There are no shortage of Bitcoiners who hate the ETFs. There are no shortage of Bitcoiners who hate, a variety of other actors participating. Anybody who doesn't self-custody, anybody who uses a custodian. Bitcoiners have problems with lots of things. I don't understand that, really. It's like some maximalists think if you're not all in, that it's weak and you're an idiot. I think you have to extend people the freedom to Bitcoin, whatever's right for them. and allow for their view to evolve, just like, all our views evolved over time. Nobody comes to Bitcoin, maybe nobody might be strong, but very few, if they're being honest with themselves, really come to Bitcoin and say, this is it, I'm all in.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think the free speech, it's so spot on, because free speech, you could say, we live in the US, I really appreciate it. I understand why the founders did what they did.
Yeah.
And you can make a very strong argument that it's imperfect. But what is the alternative?
Right.
The alternative is worse.
And that's Bitcoin, right? It's, people are going to use it in ways that you don't approve of. Mm-hmm. Just be happy they're using it, whether they're your enemies or, do you want your enemies using something else at the expense of what you love being successful? Yeah. Like when your enemies use Bitcoin, they're making Bitcoin more successful. So they're helping you.
It's aligned incentives. That's the part to me that's really fascinating. And with fiat, you can make a very strong argument that it's misaligned incentives. What I love about Bitcoin, it's aligned incentives. My incentives are aligned with everybody else who's holding Bitcoin, supporting the network, mining, running nodes. If you're hodling, we're all in the same boat.
Yeah.
And more people join the boat gets bigger, the network gets stronger, right? And it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
There's human nature. I mean, not all humans are inherently good, right? And just because your asset's good doesn't mean there aren't humans that are going to use your good asset for bad things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, Eric, 2013, right? Yeah. Now we're 2025. Time is flying.
It is.
What are you the most excited about for the next 5 years?
I'm really excited to see what this administration does. Mm-hmm. I think that, the time is now. We have the momentum. The administration is currently on our side. If we know anything about politics, we know that there's no guarantee that current views last forever. So I hope we make a tremendous amount of progress in the very short term while we have the wind at our back. Absolutely.
And what can people do, right? So, and you were talking about this earlier, right? Where I remember this phenomenon, like most of the community, most of the industry was apolitical. We were not concerned, right? Mm-hmm. Things started happening. And it's almost as if we were forced to throw our hat in the ring. But I think it's still kind of I think what I learned specifically is that politics do matter. Elections do matter. Elections do have consequences, for sure. Especially where we are in Bitcoin's history. And I think this incoming administration is going to do that. So what can individuals do to kind of contribute? Do they get vocal? Do they speak up on Twitter?
It's a great question. I mean, I agree with you that Bitcoiners were fairly apolitical. If anything, they were maybe anti-political. Mm-hmm. But then, nothing polarizes you like someone identifying you as an enemy, right? And it was the administration vilifying us that polarized us and made us think, I don't like being debanked. I was debanked, right? My fund was debanked.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I was the first crypto-related account that Signature Bank.
What year was that?
In 2017.
And it was because your association with the industry?
Yeah, it was in the title of the account that I had with them, Bitcoin Investment Group. And, Signature Bank was forced to close, even though they were not at all insolvent, according to Barney Frank, who was on the board, who was the author of Dodd-Frank, right? And a Democrat, I might add. And Signature Bank was forced to close over a weekend. It was a public company, by the way. And so everybody's account who was not a crypto account got transferred to another bank. And everybody who was a crypto account, you were told, bye. You have until such and such date to take your capital out. That happened to me.
That's crazy. But that was 2017.
No, that's when I created the account in 2017. At the time, Signature Bank became a very big bank. Uh-huh. And it was like $100+ billion bank with 20 billion of crypto-related accounts. It was primarily a New York real estate bank, a really good bank. And then this was what was this, 2023 probably.
Okay. Do you think that this, because right now the way that I kind of see the political atmosphere, the Republicans made it part of their official party platform, right? The protect the right to self-custody, protect the industry, protect the right to mine. It almost seems like and again, it's not black and white,
right?
But it almost seems like the Democratic Party has taken a more hostile stance. Do you think that they'll change course after this election? You could make a very strong argument that being anti-crypto or perceived as anti-crypto might have cost them the election.
You know, I want to be careful of pigeonholing an entire political party. If you look at kind of this woke mind virus, you know, that is going away, you're seeing a lot of people on the Democrat side saying, you know, yeah, I never really agreed with that anyway. So I want to make sure that we leave room for Democrats whose party was doing things, or the administration was doing things, or a handful of high-profile individuals within the party who took a view that doesn't necessarily reflect the view of those individuals. So, you know, you look at what happened with SAB 121, right? The Democrats did vote in favor of banks being able to custody crypto and digital assets. So I think that as education goes up and there's more understanding of the benefits of Bitcoin and digital assets, that we're going to see Democrats embrace it, if only because they're politicians and they're pragmatic, and at the end of the day, politicians care about getting elected or reelected. There's no votes for being against crypto. There's no votes for being against Bitcoin. There are millions of votes for being for it.
Absolutely, and I strongly agree with you. I do not think that this should be a partisan issue. I think Bitcoin is extremely bipartisan. It doesn't matter who you are. Bitcoin will help you, and I hope it goes towards that direction. I hope that it doesn't.
I think it will. I think it will. It'll take. You know, Bitcoin always takes a painful path when it on almost everything it does, but we'll get there, you know, we will. I mean, there's real merits to it, and people on both sides of the aisle will ultimately see the merit.
Absolutely. Well, Eric, my first in-person interview. This is an absolute honor. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it, man. Thanks for having me.